So thank you so much, please, for everyone for being a part of this virtual conference over the next several days in partnership with the Future Waves Conference in Dakar, Senegal. Again, special thanks to all of the artists, writers, thinkers, participants who are coming to be a part of both the virtual and the in-person sessions. You all are leaders and voices that are changing the way our world works in fundamental ways that will save lives over the remainder of this century. I also want to thank our partners with the United Nations, with the Senegalese government. We get together to honor the traditions of pan-Africanism and the work of Frantz Fanon in revolutionary struggle against imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, segregation, racism, and sexism, the barriers that prevent us all from reaching maximum potential in our lives. The brief talk I'm offering today and will recap at the end of the festival is titled Fortune, Fanon, and the Illmatic Consequences Across Time. This is the second in a series of talks. My first was given at Macalester College back in February of 2025, titled Peace in the 22nd Century. That talk focused on the ways that we use history wrongly to commemorate militarism, to commemorate conquest. And we do a very poor job in focusing history essentially in the modern era. And I challenge the folks that heard the talk to see the pre-modern world as the future for a sustainable humanity, for a sustainable human civilization. And that's what I hope to pick up on here today with this talk about Fortune, Fanon, and Illmatic Consequences. And so to that end, I wanted to take a moment to add on to the context for that you just heard from Tim Fielder and Ronaldo Anderson, that there's so much that has happened in the last decade around the idea of Afrofuturism and Black speculative art, where there were just a few dozen of us having these conversations back in 2014, 2015, with events like Astro Blackness or Planet Deep South. There are now tens of millions of people that are part of the movement that claimed the title of Afrofuturism. And really, more importantly, the folks who are advancing it are all of you who see yourselves as part of the Black speculative arts movement, whether it's Canada or Germany or West Africa or Latin America. There are all these sites where we are taking charge of our communities, where we are seizing the means of cultural production and the ways that materially we stand up and defend each other. That's what Future Waves is designed to accomplish in its settings, is to move the conversation away from the systems of imperialism and colonization that have dominated the last several hundred years, and to move us to a space where our autonomy is the priority, that we are meeting our own needs, that we are building our own institutions, and we are defending ourselves from folks who would come from outside and exploit us. That's what Future Waves ushers in, and a series of conversations, both with Professor Anderson and a number of other colleagues around the world, have led me to this place. And so to lay the foundation for it, I have to tell you about Timothy Thomas Fortune. Was was called the militant journalist of the 19th century, carrying on the work of Frederick Douglass as an abolitionist writer through the 1880s and 1890s. He was a mentor to Booker T. Washington. He shaped the agenda and inspired W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells Barnett. He then, in his last years, shaped Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association by serving as editor of the Negro World. All of this work in this singular figure hinged on the idea of communication and media and sharing the best information with Black people everywhere. How do we get more people to have more information so we can make the best decisions for ourselves, our families, and our communities? Timothy Thomas Fortune comes out of Marianna, Florida. His father was enslaved. As a small child, he was enslaved. His father serves in the Florida state legislature during the Reconstruction period. But Mariana was a center for Klan activity and a stronghold for the Confederacy. And so eventually they had to flee to Jacksonville. And then eventually Fortune himself went to DC to study for a bit at Howard University before moving on and becoming a publisher and an editor in New York City, most famously for the New York Age, a newspaper that has been featured and led to him being featured as a character on The Gilded Age by HBO. Fortune set the civil rights agenda for the 20th century a decade before Du Bois wrote The Philadelphia Negro or The Souls of Black Folk. This work focused on land ownership, focused on the economic and political power of Black people, not just in the United States, but in building coalition across the diaspora around the world. Most of what people don't know about Fortune is that at the peak of his career, following in the footsteps of both Douglas and Alexander Crummell, who was a minister, very prominent Episcopalian minister, the first African American in the church, moved to Red Bank, New Jersey, and in that small shore resort community, in a segregated area, built a town motivated to create Black economies across the country for the foundation of the National Afro-American League, the antecedent to the NAACP, for the creation of the National Negro Business League, the antecedent to the Urban League. He was traveling every day, every week, to raise funds across the country for sustaining Black communities, for rebuilding and transforming African American life. And at the peak, using his leverage with Washington, who then recommended him to Theodore Roosevelt, he began exploring Black repatriation across the Pacific and across the Atlantic to the Philippines and to West Africa. He was building the way that these routines would liberate us in ways that reflected Henry McNeil Turner and what he did with the AME Church. They were building the foundations of pan-Africanism before Du Bois and Garvey were making their arguments 20 and 30 years later. And so it's that foundation that I wanted to draw attention to as we consider Frantz Fanon in this Futurizing Fanon symposium. Fanon is crucial for a number of different reasons in the anti-colonial struggle, in shaping the ideas of African independence. And I also must take a second to recognize Aimé Césaire and that debate around the ideas of negritude with Leopold Senghor that led to the distinctiveness of the people of African descent in the world, our unique gifts that we bring to the table that have now manifested in what we call the Black speculative arts movement. This work from Césaire to Fanon, based on Garvey, Du Bois, Wells Barnett, Fortune, all of this is setting the table for what we see emerge, the challenge that Professor Anderson identified in the promotional video, that in fact, we are looking at a world that is collapsing. And whether you look at Malcolm X's comments or Dr. Martin Luther King's comments about the collapse of the segregationist project, the United States, and really any authoritarian government has committed itself to this kinds of abuse, this kinds of suppression of democratic accountability that are essential here in the 21st century. So when I talk about imagining peace in the 22nd century, it's doing work like the Future Waves Conference. It's hearing your voices. If you look at the schedule on the website, leader after leader, scholar after scholar, following the tradition of decolonization, following the tradition of African independence, looking for the strategies that actually liberate people in their states and communities around the world. That's what we're focused on here. It's taking Fanon's ideas and showing that violence is the root of empire, and that violence ultimately not just destroys the oppressed, it destroys the oppressor. And so by moving through this effort to take on violent resistance, as Malcolm says, by any means necessary, to defend ourselves, to defend human dignity, to build communities that are actually sustainable. This is the work that I have done honoring T. Thomas Fortune in this community that he built over 120 years ago. His community, its greatest accomplishment was the inspiration in the next generation for jazz music. A little boy named William Basie was born there as Fortune was doing his work. Basie went on to learn to play the organ and the piano, and then traveled to New Orleans and Memphis and became Count Basie, leader of the Count Basie Band, who would then transform the cultural politics of the world using jazz music over the next 70 years. That's what we have in front of us right now. The art, the music, the politics, the philosophy, the skill, the expertise, the depth of character that is required to reinvent the entire world, not in the model of the 19th century United States, not in the model of the 20th century industrial world, but to reinvent a world of individual human dignity without the kinds of imperial structures that have claimed to uphold freedom, but have always maintained exploitation and suppression. And so that's the piece that I take from Fanon today, is that we must look at the ways that we resist, both in immediate terms, as we see tanks and soldiers installed in streets across the United States. How do we actually move in a way that restores our own sovereignty and independence? That's the challenge that I would like to put out as we take on this work of the Future Waves Festival and Conference. In this sense, I have to speak to the idea of the Black speculative arts movement, the idea of Afrofuturism, and particularly Professor Anderson's idea of world order. The Black speculative arts movement for the last decade has been the most organized expression of both scholarly and artistic Afrofuturism. It has gone beyond its foundations at various kind of ad hoc events where folks of common interest shared discourse and dialogue and built important interventions together. The literary canon that has come from the last decade alone is extraordinary, but it must take another step forward at this time. It can no longer be the Afrofuturism that became a term of reference in the 1990s. It cannot remain the term that emerges out of the Ferguson revolts and resistance to stand up for Black Lives Matter. It's now an urgent cry for the way that lives matter around the world, that we meet together and find ways to build this idea of a global community rooted in African and indigenous leadership. And so Afrofuturism has already spun out into questions of design and architecture, urban planning, sharing energy, sharing fresh water, being resilient against disasters. But we must also turn towards indigenous questions. And so in this sense, in this frame, it's so essential that I work in St. Paul, where there are continuing Native American and indigenous voices from around the world gathering. Most of the work I've done in this area is related to the Maori populations of New Zealand, who have preserved their language in magnificent ways. They stand up and defend themselves in the legislature, in the streets, against the ways that they can be colonized. They are at the forefront of the efforts to prevent things like the Israeli genocide against the Palestinians, to begin to move back and preserve sovereignty and dignity for all people everywhere, to stand against the regression we've seen this week by the Russian nation against Ukraine. These are the ways that we can build out and create alliances. But for me, the piece that comes from Afrofuturism and the Black speculative arts in this moment is the idea of a world order that returns us to the pre-modern world, where there were not these so-called superpowers with nuclear weapons attempting to enforce their will and commercial dominion through their technologies. I did a project with students 2 years ago, reimagining what it was to look at the settlement of the Western Hemisphere by Europeans and to say, can you imagine if there was just an ounce of humility in this, if they had actually paid attention to the teachings of Christ that they claimed and actually had some way that they actually negotiated and built together with both Africans and the native people of the Western Hemisphere? What would that world have looked like, where cooperation was the core principle? That force of imperialism to dominate and extract and kill for profit, that was the error of the modern age. That is what set off the fields of study, whether it's Fortune, Du Bois, Fanon, whoever you would like to choose. Sylvia Wynter is brilliant on this point. What is it today for us to choose to build cooperatively outside of the spheres of empire? Where do we go to build the maroon communities of the 21st and the 22nd century, the places where we are beyond the reach of empire? That is the challenge I see facing us today, that we build a world order that looks like autonomy, that looks like our ability to dictate control of our own lives, even control of our own time, as we see in the work of Rashida Phillips, and we see dismantling the master's clock. That effort to turn away from the trappings of modernity, and to then move back to the places of dignity and solidarity. This is the challenge I see before us. And so I sit in St. Paul, and I am very sad in one sense that I cannot be in Dakar to join all the colleagues gathering as I speak. But I am facing my own very serious health issues. And so it's a miracle that I can be here with you all today and talk through some of these ideas. But this is how Professor Anderson and I have been working on these topics. The body of literature that I've seen from so many of you who have registered for the conference is spectacular. We're going to get to share art and music, enjoy food together, and we're inspiring another generation of students who will carry the ball forward. There are young people just being born today who will see the dawn of the 22nd century. And it's conversations like the Future Wave Conference that will get us started. And so with that, I will close the formal presentation